Chapter 6, The Shaping of a Nation. Part 1, The Era of Good Feeling. James Monroe, the 4th Virginia President, 1817 to 1825. In December of 1816, the Electoral College gave a complete thrashing to the dying Federalist Party when it elected the Jeffersonian Republican James Monroe to the presidency by 183 votes in his favor against only 34 votes for the Federalist Rufus King of New York. Monroe was not an exciting politician, but he more than made up for this lack of charisma with his personal dedication to the young American nation that he had served so well. He served in Washington's army and took part in many of the famous battles of the War of Independence, rising to the rank of colonel before he resigned his commission to study law under Jefferson. He would follow in the footsteps of Jefferson, becoming America's minister to France, then governor of Virginia. He then became President Monroe's Secretary of State, and thus the natural choice of the Republicans for the presidency when Madison indicated his intention to step down from the presidency after 2 terms. Although America relaxed greatly in finally finding peace with England and France in 1815, producing a lively sense of optimism, which in turn in 1817 prompted a Boston newspaper to entitle the new post-war period The Era of Good Feeling, there were, however, still a number of problems facing the country. The economic panic of 1819-1821. The biggest problem the nation faced at this point was the state of the nation's economy. The war had thrown the government treasury into deep debt, a debt financed largely by the government's borrowing from a number of private banks. This borrowing, in turn, flooded the economy with new banknotes, producing a currency inflation that threatened the financial stability of the country. Furthermore, the private sector was in just as much trouble. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the demand in Europe for America's agricultural goods, which had produced much of the prosperity of the era of good feeling, dropped away rapidly. European soldiers, after all, had returned to their farms, thus ending the demand for American farm goods. The price of farm products faded away in America, leaving farmers unable to pay the debts that they had acquired in buying more land to meet the former high European demand. Land prices also fell as farmers scrambled to sell off some of the land they had purchased. Banks that held farmers' mortgages soon also found themselves in trouble as well, the banks demanding from the farmers cash payments, cash which the farmers simply did not have. The bankrupt farmers being forced to turn their land titles over to the banks was no help to the banks, as the land was now valued at much less than the original loan the banks had extended to the farmers. Also, people now began to make a run on potentially troubled banks, demanding specie, that is, gold or silver, for the banknotes issued previously by the banks. As the banks had paper notes 10 times the value of the metallic specie they held in their vaults, they were simply forced to shut down. At this point, fortunes were collapsing everywhere. This was the first major panic, like those that would hit the country at regular intervals, such as in 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, and 1907. The pattern of the 1817 panic was also very similar to the one that developed within the American farming community just after World War I, that is, from 1919 to 1920, when the American farmer found himself in exactly the same situation. And there were similar elements in the situation during the 1930s Great Depression, when American manufacturers found that the market for their new consumer goods was saturated. Most Americans now possessing the radios, cars, record players, sewing machines, washing machines, etc., that the industrial market had the industrial market running so hot in the 1920s. It is in the very nature of venture capitalism to get caught up in these wild swings of fortune, especially because of the aggressive nature of capitalism itself. But that aggressiveness is much better in improving the national economy overall than the attempt of socialists to control all economic factors by governmental decree. Of course, some moderate amount of governmental refereeing of the economic game is wise. But the referee must itself never start trying to play the game, that is socialism, or the game simply stalls. We will see more about how these economic principles work as we go along through this study. Actually, in 1816, just prior to the outbreak of the panic, Congress had voted into existence a second Bank of the United States, in order to bring the economy under some kind of stricter management. Eventually, the financial discipline that the BUS imposed on the nation, which was tightening the country's money supply, brought down the inflation and helped stabilize the value of the nation's currency. At first, this intervention merely deepened the crisis, leaving many businesses, large and small, facing collapse when they could not repay the cheap money they had borrowed earlier with the money they now due on their loans, money that was now much more scarce and thus much more expensive for them. Then, when in early 1819 American cotton prices crashed as a result of the British purchases of cotton from India, panic set in. But the BUS did not let up on its tight money strategy despite the country's economic reversal from the inflation to deflation. Finally, the economy settled down and began to revive, though less from any activity of the BUS than from the availability of new Mexican silver to back an expansion of America's money supply in metallic specie. But not surprisingly, as with the first BUS, the second BUS would come under the intense dislike of America's vast legion of farmers who loved cheap money and inflation, since it allowed them to repay mortgage payments and other operational loans much more easily. To their way of looking at things, the banking world was simply the tool of wealthy exploiters operating out of the industrial East. Thus, sadly, the stumbling economy and the government's efforts to revive it had undermined the spirit of national unity produced by the war and revived the old sectional rivalries that divided the country. These events would also split the Republican Party into the New Republicans, in many ways similar in their economic and political philosophy to the former Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans, closer to the original Jeffersonians. These events also would bring the short-lived era of good feeling to an abrupt end. Florida. The Napoleonic Wars of 1800-1815, during which Spain had been torn between French efforts at political control of their country and desperate Spanish efforts to throw off the French grip, had left Spain greatly exhausted. As a result, Spain proved to be powerless in its efforts to head off independence movement among its Spanish colonies in America, for example, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, which erupted during this period, and where Spain continued after the war to hold on to some kind of position in America, that hold was very weak. This certainly was the case in Florida. Seminole Indian raids from Spanish Florida into Georgia and Alabama ultimately decided the fate of Florida. Because of these raids, American Secretary of War John C. Calhoun in late 1817 ordered the hero of New Orleans and Horseshoe Bend, General Andrew Jackson, to take action with respect to the Seminoles. Jackson interpreted this as being more than a call for the defense of the American borders. With the coming of the next spring, April and May of 1818, he invaded Florida, not only to decisively defeat the Seminoles, but to seize all of Spanish Florida, declaring it thus to be territory of the United States. President Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, were embarrassed, but the American nation was thrilled by Jackson's heroics. Spain, at this point, decided that wisdom called simply for the sale of Florida to the United States for the price of $5 million, confirmed in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. With the American payment in 1821 of that sum, the United States, in fact, came into undisputed possession of Florida. The Missouri Compromise, 1820. In 1819, Missouri applied for statehood, opening up a bitter controversy arising from the question about whether Missouri would enter the Union as a slave or a free state. At this point, there was a balance of 11 free and 11 slave states making up the Union. But the balance was precarious, stirring fears of the southern slave states that adding more states would swamp them in an anti-slave mood arising in the North. Slavery had been forbidden in the states of the Northwest Territory, and Louisiana had been admitted in 1812 as a slave state, and thus there was some kind of expectation that future southern states would join the ranks of the slave states. But Missouri was a border state, with slavery practiced in parts of the states, but not in others. Was Missouri thus to be considered slave or free? The Constitution itself made no mention of the issue, although one of the last acts of the Continental Congress in 1789 was to set up the Northwest Territory as a free zone forbidding slavery, indicating that the federal Congress might have such authority as well concerning the admission of territories as new states. The southern states claimed that the issue was entirely a state issue, not a federal issue. Each state could of its own decide whether it was to be a slave state or not. Nonetheless, slavery was not really a legal issue as much as a deep moral issue, with slavery clearly on a moral retreat. This made the southern states all the more uneasy, for the lifestyle of the southern fantasy of life, of the plantation aristocracy, as well as the tobacco-cotton economy itself, was completely dependent on the institution of slavery. There was no longer any talk in the South about the institution simply withering away by itself. Indeed, any talk of limiting the institution was taken as an insult or a threat to Southern culture. But the North was deeply involved in a spiritual movement of Christian revival in which slavery was one of the sins of the nations that needed cleansing. The abolition of slavery was indeed a major topic of conversation in the North, a conversation that made the South very nervous. On top of this, the population of the North was expanding much more rapidly than that of the South because of the freer culture made for greater personal opportunity. It thus drew adventuresome Americans, even Europeans, to the North rather than the South for settlement. All this tension came to a head with the question of admitting Missouri as the 23rd state. But then Maine requested entry into the Union as a new state, and the possibility of compromise seemed to present itself. Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Henry Clay of Kentucky stepped forward to offer specifics as to how this compromise might be achieved. As a package deal, Clay proposed admitting both states, one slave, one free, thus preserving the balance, coupling this with the stipulations that a line running east and west would be drawn across the country between slave and free states, along the southern borders of Missouri, but exempting Missouri as a slave state. He added the provision that the property interests of southern slave owners would be fully protected. That means the return of runaways, the ability of Southerners to travel north with their slaves without the fear of the legal loss of their slaves once in the North. And he cleverly bundled this as a single proposal so that it could not be amended by those wanting to pick its provisions apart. At the time, this compromise seemed to be a brilliant solution to the problem, which many had hoped would now go away as an issue. But Clay's compromise did not solve the problem. Instead, it brought out into ever stronger light the deep moral cultural division separating the North from the South, a division that clearly was not going to go away of its own, and indeed only grow larger with the question of the country's taking in new states to the west. The Monroe Doctrine. Meanwhile, with Spain caught up in a struggle at home between republicanists and monarchists, Spanish power overseas in the Americas was clearly slipping. After 10 years of struggle, New Spain, or Mexico, finally secured its independence from an exhausted Spain, 1821, with Central America following right behind. When in 1822 France, backed by other monarchs of continental Europe, moved to oust the constitutional republic in Spain and restore the country to monarchy, concern developed in America that Spain, or even, and more likely, France, might want to impose imperial rule on the Americas again. But Britain was just as alarmed about this as America. Britain had its own reasons for not wanting to see this happen. Britain was always suspicious of any rising European power that might upset the balance of power on the continent and overseas. For such a development would usually end up isolating Britain from the rest of Europe and from the lucrative overseas trade that Britain's economy depended on. Always a dangerous position for Britain to find itself in. Britain had been developing growing commercial relations with the newly independent republics of the former Spanish and Portuguese empires in America, which they did not want to lose through a renewal of Spanish or French imperial or mercantilist designs on the Americas. Footnote: mercantilism was commonly practiced in European imperialism, in which only the European mother country was allowed to trade with its overseas colonies. End of footnote. Thus it was that British Foreign Secretary Canning inquired of Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, about America's interest in a policy of blocking the restoration of European imperialism in the Americas. It was understood that the British Navy would be ultimately the enforcing agency of such a policy, but without any formal connection, which might stir up accusations about Adams being pro-British. The answer was in the affirmative, and took the form of a message to Congress by Monroe in 1823, actually written by Adams, in which he made it clear that the Americas had a destiny separate from Europe's, and America would defend that separation by whatever means necessary. The European monarchs scoffed at Monroe's presumptuousness, but in fact were well aware of the reality of British interests behind this pronouncement and did not actually challenge it. Monroe's final years as president, 1823 to 1825. And thus it was that Monroe finished out his presidency in 1825 with the country once again in excellent shape. The economy was booming with the expansion of American industry and trade. The American population was expanding to lay full claim to its western territories, and America found itself in no major crisis with one or another of the major European powers. The era of good feeling had been restored. The election of 1824. With the collapse of the Federalist Party, the American two-party system had thus also collapsed, complicating greatly the selection of candidates for the presidential election. The Republican Party itself was consequently split into a number of contending factions, built mostly around prominent personalities and the various geographic regions that supported them. And the spoils system of political rewards that generated widespread personal support for the leaders in Washington, with the notable exception of John Quincy Adams, who found such political wheelings-dealings to be personally distasteful. 4 different candidates presented themselves for the presidency: John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. As a consequence, none of them received a majority vote, that is, at least 50% of the total vote, and the election of the president, according to the 12th Amendment, was given to the House of Representatives to decide. But only 3 candidates were eligible for consideration under the provisions of the 12th Amendment. Jackson had received by far the most popular votes of the 4, though only a small plurality in the Electoral College, and was expecting the House to elect him. Clay, who was the 4th in the electoral count and thus not eligible for House consideration, nonetheless commanded considerable power in the House of Representatives as its Speaker. Clay personally disliked Jackson and was closer to Adams in political thinking. He convinced his supporters in the House to vote for Adams, giving Adams a full majority on the first ballot and thus the presidency. John Quincy Adams, President, 1825 to 1829. When Adams named Clay to be his Secretary of State, so far the one position that seemed a natural stepping stone to the presidency, Jackson exploded in fury. He claimed that the deal was simply a corrupt bargain and hammered away at that claim for the next 4 years. Footnote. This was quite an unfair accusation, as Clay was an outstanding statesman, very well suited for the job. Jackson's team, in fact, had also courted Clay in the hopes that he would swing his votes in the House towards Jackson. Part of Jackson's fury was a result of Clay's earlier strong stand in Congress against Jackson's invasion and grab of Florida. John Quincy Adams was much like his father, John Adams, lacking personal charm or charisma, but possessing a brilliant mind and a strong moral character. He did not particularly like politics or even the office of presidency, and did very little to build up a core of political support beneath him. He preferred to focus instead on programming various physical and intellectual improvements for the nation, from roads and canals to the encouragement of industry, to the advancement of education, to the support of the sciences. He worked hard to reduce greatly the national debt, but he faced tremendous opposition from Jackson and his supporters in Congress on every one of his programs. Foreign policy. He did not have an extensive foreign policy program to deal with because, as the former Secretary of State, he had overseen tremendous improvements in the country's international position, and because he believed that it was America's duty to not act the part of an ambitious imperialist nation, but instead to focus on the development of the Republic at home. Dealings with the Indians. He also tried to be fair in the handling of the nation's relations with the Indians, especially concerning the land rights of the large Cherokee nation in the American Southeast. Footnote. The Cherokee had gone to great lengths to accommodate themselves to Anglo culture, most of them becoming Christians and giving up their hunting economy to become settled farmers like the whites. Although they presented no danger to the whites, Southern whites could not get past their general hatred of all Indians, or at least the general hunger to confiscate Indian lands. End of footnote. But on this issue, Jackson's opposition was extremely strong, as this was a matter of great interest to Jackson's natural constituency of southern and western states, who were demanding that the Indians be removed to a location somewhere west of the Mississippi River. Overall, John Quincy Adams, though an excellent administrator as U.S. President, was sadly out of touch with a dynamic America, which others, such as Jackson, understood instinctively. Thus, Adams would serve only one term as president.